The discovery. The Galactic database was considered the most reliable source of truth in the entire known universe. Every sentient species, every element, every known disease, every tool of war and peace was carefully categorized there, and decisions made by governments often began with a consultation of its endless archives. One morning, an alert rippled through the council chambers on Varus Prime, the central world of the Galactic Union. A new entry had been uploaded, and its classification sent shockwaves across the stars. It was not a weapon built by engineers, nor a toxin created by science, nor even an ancient relic of destruction. The entry listed something biological, something natural, something bound inside a single species that had only recently joined galactic awareness. The entry declared that human adrenaline had been officially categorized as a weapon of mass destruction. Panic stirred among the representatives. Alien voices filled the council hall, their languages overlapping in fear and disbelief. For centuries, the Galactic database had served as the ultimate authority, and to find a chemical compound of a primitive death-world species branded alongside antimatter bombs and neutron storms was almost unthinkable. Delegates whispered that it must be a mistake, that humans were resilient and odd, but surely no one could believe a natural hormone could rival weapons that had shattered planets. Yet the scientists who had uploaded the classification were adamant. Adrenaline, they explained, was not simply a chemical. It was the spark of a phenomenon that changed the human body, magnifying its strength, speed, and endurance in ways no other species could emulate. The council demanded evidence, and the scientists provided it. Records of battlefield encounters where human soldiers kept moving long after wounds should have ended their lives. Testimonies from alien doctors who had seen human patients rise from deathbeds the moment danger threatened. Sports matches where humans pushed past exhaustion into performance levels that defied biology. The hall grew silent as holograms showed human civilians lifting wreckage off trapped companions, mothers carrying children across infernos, explorers climbing mountains, with frozen blood in their veins. Each story carried the same theme. When adrenaline surged, humans changed. They bent reality not with technology, but with determination and instinct. Around the chamber, fear turned into calculation. Some species remembered the early days of human contact. Those chaotic first meetings when crews stranded on desolate moons had been rescued by humans who refused to surrender. Others remembered rumors of human soldiers who fought until their last breath, not in slow retreat but in furious advance. A delegate from the Seraph Confederation leaned forward, his voice trembling as he asked if this meant every human carried a weapon within themselves. The scientist nodded and said yes. Every human body could release this force, and unlike machines, it could not be dismantled or disarmed. It was a weapon that traveled with them in their blood. By the end of the session, the Galactic Council realized the database entry was more than symbolic. It was a warning. A ripple of unease spread across the galaxy as leaders wondered what this meant for alliances, for trade, for trust. If adrenaline was a weapon of mass destruction, then humanity itself was a walking arsenal, and on Earth, blissfully, unaware, billions of humans continued their lives not knowing that their very biology had just been reclassified as one of the most dangerous forces in the galaxy. The debate, the next gathering of the Galactic Council, was unlike any before. The chamber was filled to its edges, every seat occupied by representatives of dozens of star systems. Some had traveled light years in haste after hearing the alarming news, for the idea that a species carried a weapon within their blood unsettled even the most distant powers. The great crystalline ceiling of the hall shimmered with faint light as voices echoed off the walls, a storm of fear and anger mixing with cautious reason. The Chancellor of the Council raised his voice for order, but even his authority could not quiet the turmoil at first. Delegates shouted questions and accusations, demanding to know how long this information had been hidden and who had first discovered it. Finally, the lead scientist of the research team stood at the center, presenting evidence with a calm but steady tone. She explained how adrenaline had been studied after multiple incidents where human survival seemed impossible. She spoke of a freighter fire where every alien crew member succumbed to smoke, but humans carried others to safety before collapsing themselves. She showed data of soldiers lifting equipment twice their body weight in desperate combat. She concluded by saying that adrenaline was not just a response but a transformation that could alter the outcome of entire battles. Silence followed her words, but only for a heartbeat before the chamber erupted again. A delegate from the Vrosh Dominion demanded that humanity be restricted, quarantined if necessary, for no species should walk freely when each individual could unleash the equivalent of a battlefield advantage greater than entire armies. A representative of the Thalic League argued that such fear was exaggerated, that humanity was still a young species and to treat them as weapons would only push them toward hostility. Others shouted that the Thalic were naive, that humans were already showing signs of being predators in disguise. The Chancellor struck the council floor with his staff until the echoes silenced the chamber. One by one he allowed factions to present their stance. The conservative blocs argued for preemptive containment of Earth, suggesting surveillance fleets and biological controls. The moderate voices urged caution, reminding everyone that humanity had also brought new arts, new trade, and new perspectives to the galactic community. They pointed out that adrenaline was only dangerous under stress, and that humans spent most of their lives in peace. The radicals demanded far harsher measures, whispering openly of extermination before the weapon could spread beyond control. In the midst of the arguments, a voice rose from the lower tiers, belonging to a delegate from a minor star system that had once fought beside humans against pirates. He recounted how humans had stood shoulder to shoulder with his people, holding a defensive line for hours when others had fled. He reminded the council that the same adrenaline now feared had been the reason his people still lived. His words stirred unease, for even those who distrusted humanity could not ignore the record of their loyalty and bravery. As the debate raged, a larger truth began to surface. It was not only about adrenaline. It was about fear of the unknown, of a species that had defied expectations at every turn. Humanity had grown from a single backwater planet to a civilization that adapted faster than any other. They had endured environments others could not tolerate, forged friendships across species barriers, and when pressed, fought with a fury that unnerved every witness. Adrenaline was only the latest piece of evidence that humanity was different. When the session finally ended, no decision had been made. But one thing was certain. The galaxy now looked upon Earth not as a harmless young world, but as a potential storm, a force that might one day sweep across the stars. The seeds of fear had been planted deep, and even those who spoke in defense of humans carried private doubts. The council chamber emptied, but whispers followed each delegate as they departed, whispers of survival, of war, of what to do about the species whose blood had just been named a weapon of mass destruction. First encounter, when the council could not agree on a course of action, they decided to send a controlled mission to Earth to study humanity directly. The fleet was not large, but it carried observers, researchers, and a squadron of military escorts in case matters went wrong. Officially, the mission was peaceful, labeled as a scientific expedition to deepen cultural understanding, but everyone knew the real reason. The galaxy wanted to see for itself if the terrifying stories about adrenaline were true. The fleet descended quietly into orbit above Earth and selected locations with minimal disruption. Teams landed in places where they could blend into existing research outposts and diplomatic stations. Some chose to observe human athletes, believing that the easiest way to see adrenaline at work was in contests of strength and endurance. Others went to military academies where young recruits trained with relentless intensity. A few ventured into hospitals and rescue services where adrenaline often appeared in the face of sudden danger. At first, the aliens saw little more than what they expected. Humans trained, competed, and worked like any other species. They sweated. They struggled. They laughed and complained, and they seemed far from dangerous. Some observers began to think the database entry had been exaggerated, perhaps a misunderstanding of human biology. Then came the first demonstration that silenced every doubt. In a mountain valley where a group of humans trained in survival drills, a sudden rockslide crashed down without warning. Stones the size of transports tumbled from the cliffs, threatening to bury the camp. Panic struck the observers, who scrambled for cover, certain that the fragile humans would be crushed. But what they saw instead burned into their memories forever. One soldier leapt forward with impossible speed, tackling two companions out of the path of falling debris. Another soldier, bleeding from a cut across her face, lifted a steel beam from a collapsed tent as if it weighed nothing, dragging trapped recruits free while her body shook with strain. Civilians who had been part of the drill ran barefoot across, sharp stones carrying each other to safety, ignoring pain that should have disabled them. The aliens scanned their bodies and saw it clearly. Levels of adrenaline flooding their systems, transforming them in an instant into something more than they had been. Elsewhere, another team of observers attended a sporting event. They watched. Human runners pushed themselves around the track, lungs heaving, muscles burning until one collapsed mid-race. To alien eyes, the race was over, the body defeated, but the humans staggered back up, legs trembling, and finished the final stretch. With a speed that defied every medical prediction, the crowd roared as the runner collapsed again, exhausted, but the observers stared in awe. For them, it was not a contest. It was proof that adrenaline could drive a body beyond breaking point and still carry it to victory. In the hospitals, the story was the same. Patients on the brink of death surged back when danger or desperation struck. A father who had lost half his blood still dragged himself across the floor to shield his child from falling rubble during an earthquake. A mother suffering from exhaustion carried her twins down a stairwell filled with fire. Each time the readings showed the same surge, the same transformation, and the same unexplainable endurance. By the time the observers returned to their ships, there was no more doubt. The database was correct. Adrenaline was a weapon, not in the traditional sense of blades or cannons, but in the way it transformed humans into forces of survival and defiance. The aliens argued among themselves in low voices, some in fear, some in admiration, but all carried the same truth back to the council. The galaxy had just witnessed the first real demonstration of what it meant for adrenaline to flow through human veins. The experiment, the reports sent back by the observers, shook the council chambers more than any speech could have done. Fear and fascination spread like fire, and in the wake of the evidence, a new proposal rose among the more ambitious powers. If adrenaline could turn humans into unstoppable survivors, then perhaps the same effect could be replicated in other species. Secret laboratories were established on hidden moons and research stations far from public eyes. The goal was simple: to unlock the secret of adrenaline and harness it as a universal weapon. In sterile white rooms lined with humming machines, alien scientists worked day and night. They extracted samples of the hormone from humans captured, under false pretenses, lured with promises of cultural exchange and medical assistance. They studied its structure, broke it down into compounds, and tried to inject it into volunteers of their own species. At first, there was excitement when subjects showed small signs of increased heart rate or heightened awareness, but soon the results turned dark. The alien bodies were not made for such transformation. Cells ruptured, hearts burst under the strain, and in many cases the mind dissolved into madness. Subjects screamed with uncontrollable rage or collapsed lifeless before the researchers could stabilize them. Still, the experiments continued, driven by ambition and fear. Some scientists began to realize the truth. Adrenaline was not just a chemical switch to be copied. It was bound to the strange and violent history of humanity, a species born on a world that forced them to endure extremes of weather, predators, hunger, and war. Evolution had carved them into creatures that could channel their fear into strength, their pain into determination. Without that background, no other species could simply inject the hormone and hope to survive its storm. One night, on a hidden outpost in the Red Belt system, a breakthrough of sorts was reported. A researcher claimed that a hybrid formula had stabilized within the body of a test subject. For a brief moment, the alien grew stronger, faster, and almost human-like in its defiance of pain. But within minutes, the subject tore apart its restraints. Its mind lost to frenzy and attacked everyone in the chamber. The station descended into chaos, and by the time security forces contained the outbreak, half the research team lay dead. The survivors were left shaken with the realization that they were playing with something far beyond their understanding. News of these disasters reached the ears of certain council members despite attempts to hide the failures. Whispers spread that tampering with human biology was courting extinction. Even the most arrogant factions began to hesitate, realizing that humanity was not a puzzle to be solved, but a phenomenon shaped by countless generations of struggle. Some scientists resigned in despair, admitting that adrenaline was not a tool to be wielded but an inseparable part of what made humans themselves. Meanwhile, back on Earth, word began to leak of missing citizens and strange encounters with alien envoys who asked too many questions about stress and fear. Human intelligence agencies pieced together fragments of reports and soon realized the galaxy was not simply observing them. The galaxy was experimenting on them. For the first time, humanity understood the full scope of the threat. They were not only feared, they were being studied like weapons of war, and that knowledge carried with it both outrage and resolve. Humanity had been underestimated before, but now the galaxy was learning that playing with human essence came with consequences. The seeds of confrontation were beginning to grow, and Earth was no longer ignorant of its place in the galactic order. Fear and rebellion. The revelations of the failed experiments did not stay buried for long. Rumors spread across the trade routes, and whispers echoed in the markets of every colony. Citizens began to ask questions about the humans who walked among them, questions that soon turned into suspicion and fear. To the ordinary galactic resident, humanity became a mystery that was both fascinating and terrifying. Merchants spoke of human laborers who lifted weights beyond their size when danger struck. Miners told stories of humans who dug out companions from collapsed tunnels without pausing for rest. Soldiers recounted duels where a human opponent refused to fall even after wounds that should have ended the fight. Each story carried the same conclusion. The humans were different, and that difference unsettled the galaxy. Political leaders began to act on that fear. Some worlds called for restrictions on human travel. Others demanded military patrols around Earth to monitor activity, and the most radical suggested preemptive strikes before humans could organize their strength. Secret coalitions of species met in darkened chambers, sharing intelligence on human capabilities, speaking in anxious tones about the day when humanity might decide to turn its strange power outward. To them, the adrenaline surge was not a gift of survival, but a weapon waiting to be used against the stars. On Earth, the news of these debates and the truth of the experiments reached the highest councils of human leadership. Anger swept through governments and military commands. Humanity had only just begun to step into the galactic stage, and already they were being treated as a threat to be dismantled. The idea that their own citizens had been kidnapped and dissected fueled outrage and resolve. Humans were quick to adapt, and this time they adapted by preparing for the possibility of open hostility. Fleets were reinforced, alliances were sought with sympathetic species, and intelligence operatives moved quietly across galactic space to uncover the plots forming against Earth. The fear of humans also sparked rebellion within the galaxy itself. There were species long oppressed by stronger powers who now saw in humanity not a threat, but a symbol of defiance. If a small, relatively new race could unsettle the great powers with nothing but their biology, then perhaps change was possible. Rebel groups began to reach out to human envoys, offering alliances in exchange for protection. Some planets even saw riots where civilians demanded that their governments welcome human presence instead of fearing it. The galaxy was no longer united in suspicion. It was divided, and that division grew sharper with each passing day. In the midst of this chaos, the Galactic Council tried to maintain balance, but the chamber itself had become a battlefield of words. Delegates shouted accusations across the floor. Some declared that humans were walking bombs, unpredictable and uncontrollable. Others argued that labeling a species as a weapon was unjust and would only provoke war. Every session ended without consensus, leaving tension to build like a storm across the stars. The humans themselves began to speak more openly. Diplomatic representatives stood in council halls and reminded the galaxy of their contributions, of the ships they had saved, the alliances they had honored, the lives they had risked for others. They warned that continued persecution would not lead to safety but to conflict. The message was clear. Humanity would not bow to fear. They would not accept chains simply because their bodies carried something unique. If the galaxy chose to turn against them, then humanity would fight not with weapons of mass destruction, but with the same force that had carried them through every hardship in their history, the force that lived in their blood. As rebellion stirred, as fear deepened, and as whispers of war grew louder, the galaxy braced itself. The storm was no longer in the distance. It was approaching, carried by a species who had learned long ago that survival was not granted but earned, and that when adrenaline flowed there was nothing they could not endure, the proving ground. The galaxy did not have to wait long for a spark to ignite the tension. On the outer rim of known space there was a colony world claimed by multiple factions, a place of trade and minerals that often drew disputes. It was here that a coalition of fearful alien powers chose to test humanity, disguising their intent as a border conflict. They believed that by forcing humans into open struggle, they could prove to the Council that Earth was too dangerous to be allowed freedom. What they did not expect was that their proving ground would become a testament not to fear, but to resilience. The attack came suddenly. Ships bearing false flags descended upon the colony, striking at settlements and forcing civilians into panic. Human colonists lived among other species there, farmers and traders who had no warning of the assault. When the first buildings fell and the skies filled with fire, it seemed certain the colony would be overrun. Alien soldiers advanced with superior numbers and heavier weapons, believing victory would be swift. But among the chaos, the humans did not break. Instead, they rallied, pulling strangers to safety, forming barricades from collapsed walls, turning tools into weapons, and fighting with a ferocity that stunned their attackers. Observers, hidden among the enemy forces, recorded what happened and sent it racing back to the Council. They saw a woman drag her wounded companion across open ground while plasma fire rained down, her body refusing to collapse despite injuries. They saw miners armed with nothing more than drills and axes drive back trained soldiers, eyes blazing with determination. They saw a father shield his family from falling rubble, and then rise again to carry them through fire, his body shaking but unyielding. Every surge of adrenaline turned weakness into strength, fear into fury, exhaustion into defiance. When human military reinforcements finally arrived, they did not find a colony in ruins but one still standing, defended by civilians who refused to surrender. The soldiers joined the battle, and what followed burned itself into galactic memory. Injured men and women fought side by side with their comrades, refusing to retreat. A soldier missing half his armor still pressed forward against overwhelming odds, his heart pounding with the force that the database had feared. Another soldier, bleeding heavily, carried ammunition for 3 others while continuing to fire, his own weapon. Their willpower did not fade. If anything, the longer the fight lasted, the stronger they seemed to become. The coalition forces, expecting an easy conquest, began to falter. Their weapons were stronger, their technology more advanced, but they were facing something they could not measure. They were fighting against the refusal of humans to fall. Every strike that should have ended them only seemed to fuel their determination. Panic spread among the attackers as they realized they had walked into a storm far greater than they had imagined. The proving ground had turned into a graveyard of their assumptions. By the time the battle ended, the colony still stood. Its buildings bore scars, its fields were burned, and its people were weary, but they had endured. The alien forces retreated in humiliation, unable to explain how a colony defended by ordinary men and women had resisted their might. The recordings spread across the galaxy, carried on news networks and secret channels, showing again and again the moments where humans pushed beyond all reason. Far from proving that humanity should be destroyed, the battle had proven that humanity could not be measured by ordinary means. In council chambers, the debate reignited with greater intensity. Some shouted that the recordings were proof that humans were indeed unstoppable and thus must be contained. Others argued that the recordings showed not a threat, but an ally unlike any other, a force that could endure the darkest of storms and emerge standing. Across the stars, ordinary citizens watched the footage and saw in the humans not monsters but survivors. And for many, the fear that once dominated their view began to change into awe. The proving ground had done more than test humanity. It had revealed to the galaxy that what lived in human blood was not a weapon designed for destruction, but a force born of survival, a force that carried with it both danger and hope. The question no longer was whether humanity was dangerous. The question was whether the galaxy would stand against them or beside them, for after what they had witnessed, no one could doubt that humans would never bow, not to fear, not to death, not to anyone. The verdict, the council chamber, was more crowded than it had ever been. The recent battle at the colony had reached every corner of the galaxy, and no delegate could claim ignorance. Holoscreens had replayed the scenes of human civilians fighting with strength beyond reason, soldiers pressing forward with wounds that would have felled any other species, and families who refused to abandon each other even under the rain of fire. The galaxy had seen the truth with its own eyes, and now the debate would decide whether humanity would be treated as a threat to be destroyed or as an ally to be respected. The Chancellor called the assembly to order, but voices broke out before he could speak. A delegate from the Vrosh Dominion slammed his claw against the stand and shouted that the battle was proof of the danger, that no species so unpredictable could be allowed to roam the stars. Another from the Thalic League rose in answer, declaring that what the galaxy had witnessed was not terror but courage, that the humans had fought not to conquer but to survive, and that their resilience was the very reason they deserved a place among the stars. The chamber thundered with arguments, each side refusing to yield. One by one, testimonies were presented. Survivors of the colony battle were brought forward, both alien and human, and they spoke of what they had seen. An alien miner described how a human child had pulled him from the rubble with hands raw and bleeding, refusing to let him die. A human soldier explained how fear had nearly broken him until adrenaline surged and he found himself standing again, to defend those behind him. The chamber grew restless as these voices painted a picture no database entry could capture, a picture of a species that turned desperation into power and pain into resolve. The final turning point came when a quiet delegate from a minor world took the floor. She spoke of her people, long oppressed and forgotten by the great powers of the galaxy, and she said that for the first time in generations, they had hope. She said that the humans did not inspire fear in her people, but belief. Belief that no matter how dark the odds, there was a chance to rise again. Her words carried through the silence that followed, reminding every delegate that the galaxy was not made only of empires, but of countless lives yearning for survival. When the vote was finally called, the chamber held its breath. The radicals pressed their case for quarantine and destruction, but they were outnumbered. The majority, swayed by what they had seen and heard, voted instead for recognition. Humanity would not be treated as a weapon. They would be acknowledged as full members of the galactic community, allies to be respected and partners to be approached with caution but also with trust. The database entry remained, for the science was true, but its meaning was forever altered. Human adrenaline was listed as a weapon of mass destruction, yet now it was understood not as a tool of conquest, but as proof of a will to endure that no other species could match. The humans who had sat quietly at the edges of the chamber rose and walked out with steady steps, their heads held high. Every eye followed them, some filled with respect, others with unease, but none could deny what had been decided. The galaxy had looked into the heart of humanity and found not only danger but a force that could shape the future. For the first time, the Council recognized that humanity's greatest weapon was not the adrenaline in their veins, but the spirit that refused to break. Beyond the council halls, the stars stretched wide and waiting. Humanity returned to its fleets and its colonies, knowing that the path ahead would not be easy. They would be watched, sometimes feared, sometimes admired, but never again ignored. They were no longer the newcomers from a distant death world. They were survivors, warriors, allies, and above all, they were human. And in the silence of space, the galaxy understood that a new chapter had begun, one where the strength of a single heartbeat could alter the fate of worlds. Beyond the verdict. Long after the council vote, the echoes of that decision carried across. The stars and entire civilizations felt the shift in the weight of history. For the first time in ages, the galaxy did not look to its greatest empires or its oldest bloodlines for guidance. It looked to Earth, a world once dismissed as young and fragile, now regarded as a place where survival itself had been turned into an art. Humanity did not ask for this recognition, yet it had come to them through trials of fire and blood, through whispers of fear, and through moments where they stood unbroken while others doubted. On Earth, the news spread quickly, and the people understood that their destiny had changed forever. Children looked up at the night sky with new eyes, knowing that their future no longer lay only on the blue world beneath their feet, but across countless suns. Soldiers who had fought on the proving ground carried scars not as reminders of pain but as proof of what they represented, living symbols of a truth the galaxy could no longer deny. Farmers in their fields and workers in their cities went about, their lives with quiet pride, aware that the very rhythm of their hearts carried a power others could not comprehend. In the halls of alien worlds, reactions were mixed. Some still whispered that humanity was too dangerous, a fire that might one day consume them all, but others saw hope, a reminder that strength could come from the most unlikely of places. Entire species who had lived in shadows began to rise, with courage, inspired by humans who fought not for conquest but for one another. Alliances were reforged, trade was renewed, and a quiet understanding began to grow. The galaxy had not gained a new enemy. It had gained a reminder that the will to endure was stronger than any fleet or weapon. The humans themselves did not boast of their new status. They knew that recognition was only the beginning, and that distrust would still follow them. Yet, in their silence there was strength, for they carried no need to prove what was already evident. Adrenaline was only the name given to a deeper truth, that humanity was a species who refused to surrender, who turned despair into defiance and fear into resolve. The galaxy might measure them in terms of danger, but they measured themselves in terms of survival, loyalty, and the promise of a tomorrow that could never be taken away. As the council halls closed, and the stars awaited their travelers, the final lesson remained clear. Humanity's greatest weapon was not adrenaline or strength or even their endurance. It was their spirit, a flame that burned against the darkness, a flame that once lit could never be extinguished. The galaxy now knew this, and though fear would remain, respect would remain as well. And so the story of a young race once underestimated had reached its turning point. They were no longer newcomers, but part of the great tapestry of civilizations, carrying with them the legacy of survival and the promise of a future written not in fear, but in determination. Wherever humans walked from this day forward, the galaxy would remember that within their blood and within their hearts lived the force that could change the stars themselves. The end.